Good afternoon, friends. Thank you for joining us at the North Carolina Council of Churches for the second in our Advent series of Preparing While We Wait. We, of course, are preparing to help our immigrant neighbors. And as our guest today, we have with us from Church World Service, Joe Furtick. Joe has been working in refugee resettlement for the last 5 years, and he most recently ran the Central American Minor Program for Church World Service and the National Network in petitions filed for parents on behalf of their minor children. When I read that part of your bio, Joe, I couldn't help but think if you had been involved in any of the many separation cases that happened in 2017 and following, and how sad it is that so many of those children have yet to be reunited with their parents. So maybe you can share some of that with us. Joe has a lot of information to give us today. Primarily, we have asked him to talk about the different immigration statuses that exist for people and what exactly it means when we say undocumented. So he has lots of information. I'm not going to steal any more of your time, Joe, because I think what you're going to offer us today will go a long way toward helping us know how to connect and how to be allies for our immigrant neighbors. Thank you, Joe.
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today. If you give me just a moment, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint prepared, and I think that I can go ahead and start this, and then we'll say display settings. All right. How does that look?
Great.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, first, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. It's been a very daunting couple of months, but it gives me a lot of hope and energy to see so many people here showing up to learn more about and support our immigrant neighbors that live here in North Carolina. Just as a little background, again, my name is Joe. I'm the Associate Director of Immigration Legal Services at CWS Durham. Church World Service is a global organization, but here in Durham, we primarily provide resettlement services for refugees. So refugees who come to the United States, and we provide case management and employment and low-cost immigration legal services. So it's just a little bit about us. We've been in operation since 2009, and our Immigration Legal Services Office has been in operation since 2012. All right. So first, again, thank you so much for the invite. If you are here listening in to this call, then I would assume that you align with the mission of the NC Council of Churches, which is to educate, inspire, and mobilize faith communities to advocate for justice and to impact the state on issues such as economic justice and development, human well-being, inequality, and compassion and peace. Just to start having these conversations is really important in our communities. And I think before we can even start having these conversations, it's really great to know what we're talking about. So I really appreciate you all being here. So I will say the NC Council of Churches aligns very much so with Church World Service, where we are working to create a world where everyone has access to food, a safe place to live, and a voice, right? And we are always working toward this vision where everyone has food, voice, and a safe place to call home. All right. So there are only 3 agenda items here. So overview of various immigration statuses. I'm going to talk a little bit about Trump's potential immigration agenda. Again, this is potential. It's still unknown. We're not in January yet. And then I'm going to briefly kind of explain what are things that you can do to advocate for the immigrant community here in your community, wherever you're calling in from in North Carolina. There are only 3 items, but within those items, there's quite a bit of information I'm going to share. My understanding is that this meeting is recorded, so if you would like, you're always welcome to go back and rewatch if there's something that maybe you didn't quite catch. So first, I just want to share a couple of statistics with you about immigrants in North Carolina. This is back in 2020. I didn't quite find the information for 2023, 2024. But in 2020, 8% of the North Carolina population were immigrants, and that's 1 in 9 workers. They contributed $7 billion in taxes in 2018. That's billion with a B. And back in 2015, we had about 41,000 refugees in North Carolina. So just so you know, the kind of the communities we're working with is quite a large number, right? I think the current population in North Carolina is right around 12 million. So maybe just shy of 1 million immigrants living in North Carolina. Okay. So before I get started talking about immigration statuses, I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page of what's the difference between someone who is undocumented and someone who is documented living in the United States. All right, so I provided a basic definition here. An undocumented immigrant are individuals who have either entered the United States without inspection, so they were never encountered by Border Patrol, potentially. So they enter the United States without inspection, and have not subsequently applied for an immigration status, or they enter the United States with a valid visa, but that visa has since expired. So there we go, basic definition of an undocumented immigrant. There are many ways where someone could potentially find themselves to be undocumented, but some of the most common ways are, again, to enter the United States without inspection and to not apply for an immigration benefit. But another way could be potentially to come to the United States with a visa, maybe a student visa, and you don't fulfill the minimum course of study requirement, or you're working without authorization to support yourself. You would then find yourself to be undocumented. I think currently there are over 10 million. I don't quite remember the exact number, but I think it's right around 12 to 13 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. Okay. So next, I just want to be really clear with this, that asylum seekers are not undocumented per se. It's a little tricky here, but they are not considered undocumented. I have a visual here just to kind of briefly overview some of the process of the asylum seekers, and just give you a second to look at this while I speak, but we can actually walk through this together. So first, for an asylum seeker, you come to the United States, and you're fleeing from violence, persecution, and you come to the United States and you're apprehended at the border by a Border Patrol agent. Okay. Then you conduct a credible fear interview. Okay. This credible fear interview is just essentially detailing, does the officer believe that you have a credible fear of returning to your home country? Is it possible that you could return or not? Or is it likely that you should be admitted into the United States to apply for asylum? So then, let me move my screen a little bit here. Right. So then again, if no fear is found, then you are removed from the United States. If fear is found, then you start your hearing process and your court process. But again, asylum seekers are not undocumented. They have the lawful right to apply for asylum after being, admitted in, well, not really admitted, but after entering the United States. Okay. So I wanted to also break down. So I talked a little bit about asylum seekers. But again, asylum seekers are those individuals who are fleeing from violence and persecution, religious persecution, political persecution, and they're coming to the United States for protection, right? Their government could not offer them that level of protection, but they've come to the United States seeking that form of protection. There are two different types of asylum, right? There is affirmative asylum, and then there's defensive asylum. So defensive asylum is where you have been detained and you have been placed in removal proceedings. You have a court hearing coming up. It could be several years away. but you are defending yourself, right? Whereas with affirmative asylum, you are affirmatively applying for asylum. Maybe you enter the United States with a visa, and the country conditions where you come from have deteriorated, and now you're applying for asylum. We also saw this a lot during the Afghan evacuation. We saw, upwards of 70,000 Afghan nationals who worked with the U.S. military, worked for the former Afghan government, come to the United States with parole. We'll talk again about that. So temporary status, and then they were able to apply for affirmative asylum because they were not automatically placed into removal proceedings. Currently, there are more than 2 million pending asylum cases. It's a giant backlog. And the wait times are extraordinarily long. For affirmative asylum, 6 years. For defensive asylum, it's 4 years, and it can be much longer. It's just an average. It can be much longer than 6 or 4 years. I've seen some cases that have been appealed and so on and so forth that have gone on for 20 years. So it's not a quick process. I also wanted to share, when we're talking about asylum seekers, it's not always easy to find representation for asylum. The cost of representation can vary, but it is a very expensive process. It can cost, again, upwards of $20,000 to apply for asylum, to have legal representation. I've seen cases where it's been more, I've seen cases where it's less, but it's a very, very expensive process. The other issue we have in the United States is that there are different immigration courts all throughout the United States, different circuits. And those circuits employ different judges, and those judges' approval rates vary significantly, very significantly. So I was looking at data over the weekend in preparation for this presentation, and I didn't realize this, but some of the approval rates in the United States can be as low as 1.2%. That's 1% for one judge, and then as high as 98.2 for other judges. And that is a significant discrepancy. And my assumption is not that asylum seekers' cases are so much different, right? It's really just how the judge interprets the case. So you have huge variations. All right. In Charlotte, we have some of the highest rates of denial in our Charlotte immigration courts. We have denial rates between 98% and 76.7%. Those are denial rates, not approval rates. So 98 points for one immigration judge, 98.2% of cases that come across their desk, so to speak, are denied. Yeah, it's pretty alarming. All right. All right, let me see. Next slide. I also wanted to share this graphic with you. And these are the most recent numbers I've seen, but as you see, there are pending asylum cases here, 800,000, and it's significantly more now. I mean, and it has grown over the years. Some of the reasons for this backlog have been funding shortfalls and difficulties in filling vacancies for USCIS officers, for officers who adjudicate cases, for judges, and there really just aren't enough people to hear these cases. I'm also hearing from different sources that this number of in the backlog could double by the end of the decade, by 2030, which is alarming. All right. So again, asylum seekers. This chart is for total asylum approvals by nationality in 2022. So I think a lot of people think of asylum seekers as Mexican nationals, as maybe even as Venezuelan, and in part that is true. But really, when you start looking at the numbers here, China makes up the largest number of asylum grants, again, approved asylum cases in the United States, and then Venezuela, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And there's maybe some countries on there you wouldn't expect, like Turkey or Russia. Um, but again, it's a pretty wide variety of countries. All right, let's see. So we've talked a bit about asylum seekers as an immigration status. That is, I would consider that to be an immigration status. And actually, I want to roll back on one thing. After once you are released into the United States, you generally speaking have 1 year to file for asylum. 1 year. So that means you need to figure out everything else to do, right? You have to find a place to live and food and all the things that you need to live in a completely new country that you've never lived in, potentially, or probably never lived in before. And you also have to secure legal representation within 1 year of being released. And again, I go back to legal representation can cost upwards of $20,000 for one asylum application. The issue as well with our system is you are not authorized to work in the United States until you have filed for asylum and you have waited, generally speaking, again, about 180 days. Then you can apply for work authorization. So until that moment, you're not authorized to work in the United States. And you have to think too about the journey to get here can be really expensive. And I'll go into that a bit more later as well. But so first, immigration status, asylum seekers. Next are refugees. So refugees and asylum seekers, very different populations, very different immigration status. So refugees are, I think, essentially speaking, refugees are identified outside the United States. They are registered with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Well, actually, let me back it up a bit. So say someone flees violence, they have to leave their home country, but they don't come directly to the United States. Maybe they're living in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a lot of violence in the eastern regions of Congo, and they flee into Uganda, and they find a refugee camp there, right? It's not possible for them to then travel to, another place where they can kind of live permanently. So there is a refugee resettlement system that was created in 1980 in the United States to identify those individuals for resettlement and for them to then come to the United States with a status of being a refugee. Refugees, they go through multiple interviews, really, really the most extensive background checks you can imagine. And they complete medical exams as well. And when they come here, they have an indefinite status that does not expire. So, and when I say those background checks are really extensive, they are very, very extensive, very, very extensive. So, all right. So here is the definition of a refugee. And this is any person who has fled their home country because of persecution or well-founded fear of persecution. And these 5 categories are actually really important to being granted refugee or asylee status or winning your asylum case. So they are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. If it's not within one of those categories, you have to make an argument for why it does fall under one of those categories. So for example, if you're being discriminated against because of your belonging to a specific group, maybe like, I don't know, an indigenous group, then you would have to make the argument that you fall within a particular social group. Okay, so again, it's these five categories, these 5 categories only. All right, so here is just a visual for some of where refugees come from. And it is a lot of different countries, but in North Carolina, predominantly speaking, they're from Afghanistan, from Democratic Republic of Congo. We have a lot of Syrian refugees, Burmese refugees, and it's a pretty diverse pool, right? Colombian, Venezuelan, Central American as well. I think our clients speak dozens of languages. Okay. And then I wanted to share this too, just to give you some insight into what I would call the global migration crisis, what many would call actually a global migration crisis, and that there are currently 122.6 million people who have been forcibly displaced. That means they cannot return home. That could be within their home country. That could be that they left their home country, but there are 122.6 million people who had a home and can no longer return to that home. Um, it's no longer safe. All right. And then from those 122.6 million people, there are 43.7 million refugees. And when people think about refugees, maybe a number of different images come to mind. But the image that comes to my mind from these statistics that I've known working at CWS is that refugees are children. Most refugees are children, account for 41% of those who are forcibly displaced. Which is it's pretty awful statistic, but refugees are kids. All right, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of the history of refugee resettlement. Refugee resettlement was something that was very informal prior to the year 1980, when the Refugee Act of 1980 was passed and formed. So if you follow this visual, you can see, of course, the end of the Vietnam War. There was a pretty large uptick in Asian refugees coming from Vietnam. And then, again, a pretty large uptick following the Refugee Act of 1980. You see that mostly speaking, a lot of the refugees that were resettled, within these periods prior to 1993 are of Asian. But then you start to see there are other things that have happened, right? The fall of the Soviet Union, we agreed to resettle a large number of refugees who were impacted by the Yugoslav wars when Serbia invaded Bosnia. So we agreed, universally and globally speaking, that we would accept a large number of those Yugoslav refugees. And so there is a pretty extensive history of refugee resettlement in the United States. It's not something that started happening, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. That we're talking about, over 50 years of history. And refugee resettlement started to occur informally following World War II, right? The UN came together and said it's not acceptable that there are so many refugees who were turned away from the United States during World War II who needed a safe place to call home, but were turned away and had to return to World War. There are a number of stories of Jewish refugees who were turned away from the United States, had to return to Europe, and then found themselves in concentration camps. So, but again, so we start to see, again, another pretty steady refugee resettlement. And the thing that I like to point to is that, Bush won, a very conservative president, right? Republican president. And you look here, he's got, quite a number of refugees that are resettling. I think at one point you're looking at close to 75,000 or maybe 55,000. And that's following 9/11. And then into the Obama years, they still remain relatively high. And then we have the dip in the Trump years. Yeah, Trump's first year in office, admissions were 50,000, dropped to 40,000, then 18,000, and then he really threatened zero, but I think ultimately there were 6,000 or so refugees. And every year, the president sets the admission cap for the number of refugees that can be resettled in the United States. So the president says 125,000, like Biden administration did, then we resettle 125,000. If the Trump administration says zero, then it's zero. It's just the power that the executive office has as it relates to immigration. So, yeah. All right. So I think I touched a little bit on this, but length of stay for refugees are indefinite. Talked a bit about the refugee and vetting process. After 5 years after being admitted into the United States, refugees they can apply for U.S. citizenship. Again, they have to be in the United States for 5 years. And then they are able to apply. After 1 year, by law, they're actually applying for green cards. And yeah, and then I think I touched a bit about this, the origin of refugee resettlement with the prior following World War II and the Refugee Act of 1980. So I'll pass that. All right. So next, let's talk about asylee status. So we talked about asylum seekers who are seeking asylum in the United States, who are looking for protection. Then there are refugees. Now there's asylees. Asylees are those individuals who were once asylum seekers, but their asylum application was approved. So they sought protection, an immigration judge or an officer said, you know what, it is too dangerous for you to return to your home country because of persecution related to religion, national origin, political social group, or particular social group, political opinion, all that good stuff. And so asylees also have a pathway to citizenship. They can apply for a green card 1 year after their asylum approval. And they very much mirror refugees in so many ways. So the only difference is that an asylum seeker came to the United States to seek protection, whereas refugees were identified abroad. Okay. But indefinite length of stay can apply for citizenship 4 years after asylum case is approved. So I got a few more immigration statuses I'm gonna walk by you. Most people may have never heard of this, but it's called temporary protected status, and it's TPS. And this is this is an executive power, but TPS is an immigration status that allows certain foreign nationals to live and work in the United States. The Secretary of DHS, which is Secretary Mayorkas, can designate a country for TPS due to one of the following reasons, the bottom of the slide. So first reason, ongoing armed conflict, such as a civil war, an environmental disaster, so earthquakes and hurricanes, an epidemic, or other extraordinary and temporary conditions. So the idea for TPS was that, and is really that individuals are inside the United States, maybe they're seeking asylum, but they can't return home because of ongoing armed conflict or an environmental disaster, right? An epidemic. So they're offered protection inside the United States until it is safe for them to return home. So nationalities who are TPS recipients, go to this, Venezuela, El Salvador, Honduras, Ukraine, Afghanistan. So in total, there are just shy of 1 million, so 863,000 foreign nationals from 16 countries who are TPS recipients. That's temporary protected status again. And so I have a list here of those individuals, the majority coming from Venezuela, where I think, if you haven't already heard, I'm sure you have, there's a lot of political oppression. There's a lack of resources, food, water, shelter. So again, it's designed as a temporary protection. But however, if it is not safe for those nationals to return, then the TPS can be extended. So it's every 18 months. I'm going to skip that. Oh, I'll come back. So it's an 18-month grant of TPS, and every 18 months it's renewed. Right. So you have to apply for to renew your TPS kind of designation, or you have to or it can automatically be extended. But it's only every 18 months. So every 18 months, there are certain nationalities that are sitting there with their fingers crossed going, I really hope it's approved again. And the thing about temporary protected status is it is not a pathway to citizenship. There's no pathway to citizenship or staying permanently in the United States through temporary protected status. This is kind of it. You're authorized to work and stay for short periods of time. I'm going to skip this. All right. And I'm sure you've seen this on the news, right? heard of DACA, I'm sorry, and Dreamers. So DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. It was established by the Obama administration in 2012. They basically realized that there were, millions of children in the United States who came to the United States when they were quite young. And they had basically no options, no legal options for them, no lawful options for them to remain in the United States. They were just undocumented. Their parents brought them here, and that was it. And I'm realizing I've been talking longer than I realized, but so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. But for DACA, to have applied for DACA, you had to be under the age of 31, 2012. Came to the United States before reaching your 16th birthday. And you must have continuously resided in the United States since June 15, 2007. So you couldn't be traveling back and forth between maybe your home country and the United States to qualify or to request DACA. Okay. And then you also had to have no lawful immigration status on June 15, 2012. And then this is, I think, really only remains to DACA and certain student visas. So you had to be enrolled in school or have graduated or obtained a GED or a high school diploma to qualify for DACA. So you have to be educated in a certain sense. And you cannot have been convicted of a felony or more than 2 significant misdemeanors to qualify for DACA. So that's DACA eligibility. The thing I really wanted to share is who the Dreamers are, who DACA recipients are. And the pieces of data I really wanted to highlight on the screen is the average age of arrival for DACA recipients is 6.1 years. So if you're looking at, over 500,000 people who qualify for the status, and the average age that they were when they arrived in the United States was 6. 6-year-olds don't have a choice of whether they migrate to the United States or not. The choice was taken from them. It was made by their legal guardians, their parents, whoever they were with. So they had no way of saying, no, I don't want to come to the United States. Right? They're 6. And then the average current age, I think this is as of 2018, was 25.7 years. And again, I want to highlight a couple more things: the percentage that are currently employed and employed before DACA. So there's a significant rise in the number of people who are now working and contributing to their communities in really meaningful ways. All right. And then I really like this visual. It's a really great visual. And how much DACA recipients contribute to their communities, to the United States. They pay basically $9 billion every year in state and local taxes and federal taxes. Approximately 20,000 DACA recipients are teachers. They're in education. 34,000 work in healthcare, caring for patients. I think this is actually lower than some of the statistics I've seen. I've seen upwards of 40,000. And then 100,000 help feed America. So these are some really critical jobs for the United States that DACA recipients are providing. And that if they were to lose this DACA eligibility, it would be a pretty big hit to the United States. I mean, 20,000 educators are not going to be easy to replace. Okay. So, and here's what I'll do. I know these are a lot of statistics to share. I will ask that the slides are shared with everyone. So if you miss something, that you could, instead of just watching the video, you can also go to the slides too. Because I am throwing a lot of information at you today. So I'm going to briefly talk on parole status. That's why there's not going to be a lot of information on that, but I will say parole is something that the Biden administration has utilized pretty heavily. They utilize it for the Afghan population. It was originally designed for individuals who needed medical attention in the United States to come to the United States for medical attention or for medical treatment temporarily. Or, for example, you have lost a loved one. They died within the United States. Then you apply for parole to potentially attend that funeral and to see and support the family within the United States, right? Instead of applying for a tourist visa, maybe. Parole is temporary. It's generally speaking between 1 and 3 years. Ukraine and Venezuelan and Afghan populations were huge recipients of parole. There was this giant Uniting for Ukraine program. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. Uniting for Ukraine, U4U, where we basically agreed to take in over 100,000 Ukrainians who were impacted by the war, mostly in eastern Ukraine. So instead of just offering them, a pathway to citizenship, we offered them this temporary stay with the hope that the war would end after a couple of years. But we're almost 3 years out now. It'd be 3 years in February, I believe. And yeah, there's no end in sight. So yeah. All right. So next is temporary agriculture workers. These are the H-2A non-immigrant visa recipients. So for temporary agriculture workers, there are about 310,000 visas that were issued in 2023, which is just over half of the agriculture workforce. I also included a statistic here. I know it's not about temporary agriculture workers, but in the United States, about 42% of all crop farm workers in the United States were undocumented, lacked legal authorization. And I think that's still the same today. So 42% of all crop farm workers do not have the authorization to work in the United States. But going back to temporary agriculture workers, it's a temporary job. The companies that are hiring or the farms that are hiring have to demonstrate there aren't enough U.S. workers who are able, willing, and qualified and available to do the work. They're not, and show that they won't adversely affect the wages and conditions of similarly employed U.S. workers. And once you're granted an H-2A visa, I believe that visa expires after 3 years. So those are temporary agriculture workers. And again, it is a specific status just for agriculture, and you are here for a season, right? And then you're returning home and coming back for the next season, returning home, coming back for the next season. So now we've made it to undocumented immigrants. I talked a bit about the definition of undocumented in the very beginning, but there are some key points I also wanted to highlight here when we're thinking about undocumented immigrants from an economic perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, right? That half of undocumented immigrants or adults are married. And compared to US citizens, undocumented immigrants are more likely to head households with children. Most undocumented immigrants are members of families that have mixed legal status. So they could have, total of 12 million US citizens, 6 million US citizen children live in household with a mixed legal status, right? Maybe their siblings are undocumented, maybe their parents are undocumented. So nearly all income received by undocumented immigrants comes from wages and self-employment income. Another thing I always like to highlight when we're thinking about undocumented immigrants is that they contribute and I could be wrong here, but I believe it's just over $800 billion a year in taxes that they will never see back. They don't see back, right? They're not eligible for Social Security, generally not eligible for Medicaid, depends on the state. But generally not eligible for public benefits that they're paying into. Most undocumented immigrants are established. They've lived in the United States for 16 years or more. It's a long time. A lot of undocumented immigrants have spent more time in the United States than they did in the country they were born in. And then again, they're kind of all over the US, So, all right. And again, I promise we'll share these slides so you can potentially go back and review this data at the end. Oh, I was way off. It's 96 billion. Sorry, I was thinking 80 billion. I said 800 billion. $96.7 billion tax contributed by undocumented immigrants in 2022. So again, here's a quick quick visual of those taxes paid. And then we'll count time. All right. Okay, so now made it to agenda item number 2. I'm sorry, agenda item number 1 took quite a bit of time going through all the immigration statuses, but agenda item number 2. So I'm gonna try to work through these quickly so we have a bit of time for Q&A. So possible plans for the Trump administration are mass deportations. Talked about mass deportations a lot, and the hope of deporting 1 million people every year for the next 13 years is kind of the hope of the Trump administration to deport. And I said that he wants to deport every undocumented immigrant in the United States. For him to do that, I think the estimated cost annually would be between 88 billion and $315 billion a year. That's coming from the American Immigration Council. That's right. So we're thinking, up to $315 billion a year to carry out these plans. So I'm just gonna, and this doesn't even take into account the taxes that undocumented immigrants are paying, right? So I'm gonna show this statistic too, just as an alternative. If we were to carry out these mass deportations and we were to use that same money, or we were just to use that money that we would spend on mass deportations, we could do the following things. Build 40,000 new elementary schools, 2.9 million homes across the United States, fund Head Start for 79 years. I mean, it would be pretty incredible what we could do with that money as a nation. Okay. But again, here we are. To carry out mass deportation too, you would need a lot of detention facilities. So there would have to be a lot of building as well. So but again, we're not quite sure what the Trump administration is doing, what their plans are exactly yet. But we'll start to find out in 2025. The Trump administration has said that they will likely drastically reduce refugee admissions. Well, I remember when I showed you the chart, that the Trump administration really started to reduce the number of refugee admissions, and they may be doing this again as well. So we may see a real significant drop in the number of refugees being admitted to the United States. The other thing the Trump administration has done in the past is that they've used forms. So basically, if you don't receive an immigration status, or you list someone who's undocumented on a form, or maybe you had a prior removal order, they could use this form where you are applying for an immigration benefit, maybe a work permit or something, or some immigration status, to target undocumented individuals. Okay. Then there will likely be, I've heard that Trump could target DACA, although in an interview just a couple of days ago, he said he wants to work with the Democratic Party, with different lawmakers to maybe maintain DACA. So, we'll see. But the thought is that DACA is going to reach the Supreme Court within the next year or two, and that a ruling will be made. One of the really tough things too, when we're thinking about families who are separated, US citizens, these are green card holders, refugees who are separated from their families, is that as the Trump administration between 2016 and 2020, they stopped replacing staff who were in embassies all over the world, which means that there were less people to process cases. So then we had a larger backlog. So it made it harder for people to be reunited with their families, with their spouse, with their kids. And then let's see, there are a couple of other things here. I won't get into much, but there's talks of increasing fees pretty significantly. They're already pretty expensive. I think a green card application currently costs $1,440. There's talk of that increasing even more. So, all right. So we said possible plans. All right. I think I'm right at time. So, here's what I would say is important for us to do as a community, and that is advocacy work. It's really important to go out and advocate for our communities. So I have a link here for the top 5 ways to take action in supporting refugees. This is also a link to basically like policy updates. So you can sign up for emails, and those emails come through from CWS that tell you about any policy changes that that will happen in 2025 that you could advocate for or against. But really important is our that our representatives know that we support the immigrant community, right? So we're calling them, we're sending them messages. I've done this a number of times, and a lot of our representatives, even Senator Tillis's office, have been very receptive to these phone calls. Another thing that's really important and can be important is commenting on Federal Register documents. So, you know, generally the Federal Register, they open these, the documents are opened and you have the chance to comment within 30 to 60 days of any changes. And litigators who are litigating these, these actions or policies, look to these comments and use them as a base for their litigation efforts. So they can say, hey, look, there were thousands of people who said this is a terrible idea. So these comments can be really helpful. Okay. I'm gonna skip some of this. And then I'll say I linked again the action alerts here. So if you want to go and sign up for action alerts, please do. We also post a good amount on social media. We have Twitter and Facebook as well, just if you would like to keep up and see what we're doing. I also would like to share my work contact information. So that's my email. So if you have questions afterward, or you're just curious about something, or you want to connect, feel free to email me. And this is also my office cell phone number as well. So yeah, so please feel free to take that down if you'd like. And then I included some resources, but I'm going to skip that just for the sake of time to give people a chance to do some to answer some questions if they have them. I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe, so much for that presentation. It was it was extremely enlightening. And, we hear so much about these types of immigrants, on the news and everywhere in articles and stuff, but you never really get to hear the details about each one. So I feel like you did a great job going over each one, being very robust and comprehensive with that. We've had quite a lot of engagement in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and start asking some questions that we've got.
Yeah, go for it.
So, okay, while waiting for an asylum hearing, since people aren't able to work, how are they supported? Like living expenses, housing, etc. And are there any specific opportunities for community members to take to support them while they wait for their hearing?
That is a great question. So how do they work? Generally, I found that asylum seekers are forced to work under the table, right? And that sets them up for a number of it can set them up for exploitation, right? Where they feel like they don't have any power to say yes or no, or to be treated well as a worker. So I find a lot of people, maybe they work under the table before they have that employment authorization just to support themselves, support their families. Some asylum seekers came with children, and they don't have the option to just not work. Some are very fortunate and they have family members to support them. And originally, this system was created back in the 90s when the majority of individuals who are seeking asylum were maybe, employable Mexican nationals were adults. So, it really isn't set up for the current need of the United States. And then supporting asylum seekers, that is a great question. And I think kind of a long answer. Feel free to email me and I'm happy to come back with that one, or because there are a number of projects that we are looking into as well to support asylum seekers that are just kind of in the beginning stages. So
That's great. And maybe in a follow-up email, we could share some resources for those folks if they are interested in supporting in that way.
Yeah.
Another question we had was, is it helpful or even possible for witnesses to be present during asylum hearings?
Not possible, just due to the nature of how like the confidentiality piece, it's not possible to go to an asylum hearing. Um, so oh, and I did want to say what I was going to make one more point. Oh, there have been a lot of churches that have actually stepped up and helped asylum seekers in so many fantastic ways, who have supported asylum seekers, and just it's just exceptional to see some of the services they provided and the ways that they've stepped up. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yes, we've definitely interacted with a lot of those churches who have been very supportive of asylum seekers. And it is very, it's just a great way to support especially while they're waiting here. But yes, another question we had, if people are denied asylum, what happens? Do they stay here undocumented, or how would they be returned to their country of origin, and who pays for that?
That is a great question. Let's see. So, okay, who pays? Okay, so it really depends. So if you're applying for affirmative asylum, then your case is referred to an immigration court, to the immigration court. So instead of it being with USCIS, then it goes back to, you're in front of an immigration judge, and you have a chance to still continue to defend yourself. But if you apply for defensive asylum, then yeah, I mean, ultimately, let's say you don't attend one of your hearings, then you'll be removed, what's called removed in absentia, which means you didn't attend, but you're issued a removal order. I want to say that the government pays for removals, right? It's not other countries, it's us. We pay for those removals. The issue as well is that there are some countries who do not accept uh, individuals that we want to deport, Venezuela being one of those countries. So what that could mean is that there are Venezuelan immigrants who are living in detention, sort of in this limbo period where they can't return to Venezuela because Venezuela isn't accepting them, but they were ordered removed, so they may not be able to just go back out and live in the United States, which is a really tough place to be. So yeah, those people who are in detention. I've seen some individuals in ICE detention for years, just caught up.
Wow. Can you tell us about how a person becomes protected under TPS, and do they have to prove when they enter the United States?
Yes. So let's say I'll use Ukraine as an example. So someone potentially they come to the United States through the Uniting for Ukraine program. They had a financial sponsor, and they're given 2 years of parole, and then TPS is announced. And what the TPS announcement will say is that you had to be physically residing in the United States since this specific date. If you weren't residing in the United States before that specific date, you're not eligible. And I think the thought behind that is that you don't have people flooding into the United States to receive TPS at a future date. So, hey, I just need to make it to the United States before this date. It starts kind of earlier on. So, and it's that the government recognizes that there are a lot of people who need protection who don't have any other form of protection. And so, yes, there is a date that people have to come to the United States by. But asylum seekers could qualify for TPS as a form of protection. So, yeah.
Great, thank you for that. And where can we find some of that data you mentioned about the immigration court's rates of approval?
It is publicly available. I was looking at it last night, and I can share that as well. But it's pretty interesting to see just across the different immigration judges the rates of approval and denial. They're just very very different. Yeah.
Right. Here's one about kind of the DACA status, and since you mentioned Trump's planning on targeting some of the DACA recipients. What for those who were granted DACA status, were most of them able to apply for full citizenship, or how'd that come about? And I guess what the threat will be for in the next couple of years, 4 years or so.
Yeah, that's a great question. So DACA, like TPS, is not a pathway to citizenship. So it is a temporary form of protection for 2 years, and it has to be renewed every 2 years. You renew your DACA status. And what I didn't share, because I think it just ran out of time, was that there are millions of potential DACA recipients who can no longer apply for DACA because there was an injunction on the program. So now they're only doing renewals, no more initial applications. So there are over 1 million people who could qualify for this program who are undocumented, who could have work authorization, who came to the United States when they were kids, but for whatever reason they didn't apply and they can't access it. But no pathway to citizenship, unfortunately, for DACA.
Wow, thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Let's see, there's another question on, will folks placed by refugee agencies such as Lutheran Services be deported if they come in through government channels?
No, so I've partnered with Lutheran quite a few times. I love the work they do in Raleigh, but traditionally, no. Traditionally speaking, no. So if they are admitted through the refugee resettlement program, they're coming to the United States as refugees, and that refugee status, after the passing of the Refugee Act of 1980, it is this indefinite status. It's forever, as long as you're not deportable, right? Like you're not committing these really egregious crimes or trafficking, copious amounts of drugs, which you're not seeing in the refugee populations anyway. But it's an indefinite status, so there's really no there should be no fear of removal for that population.
Great. Thank you for that. I think we have time for a couple more, and I've got actually a couple more as well. For some asylum seekers that maybe have a notice to appear for a defensive asylum case, are they vulnerable for mass deportation?
Oh, here's the thing though, is I'm gonna go ahead and preface this by saying I don't do defensive asylum work. So just from what I've learned in my experience, I'll go ahead and say my answer is no. That you have the lawful right to seek asylum, as long as you're applying within that year, or like you have to go through the proper channels to be removed, right? So you have the right to those hearings. Again, that's as long as you're not, violating the terms of kind of your asylum seeking status, right?
Great. Thank you for that. And I have maybe just one more. There's, almost more than half or almost half of crop farm workers are undocumented. And if there are mass deportations that take place, is there maybe some sort of plan? Do you know if there's a plan in the administration, the next one, to replace those workers if we start deporting them?
See, I have that same question. It's like, my thought process would be that, or the hope would be that the new administration recognizes the need for these crop workers and that they don't target them, because it would be a significant hit to you know, our food supplies. So I would think the answer would be no, that they hopefully would not target agricultural workers, but who's to say? And I have yet to hear of a plan from the new administration saying, if we're going to target this population, how do we replace that population? Because the same thing can be said about TPS workers. I know there's a guy, he's a lovely guy. He's from El Salvador. He's been in the United States for almost 21 years with temporary protected status, and he is running one of the projects that is connecting 540. So he builds bridges, literally builds bridges. And he's doing very, very great work there. He's told me about it. And but yeah, there is no plan to replace um this workforce. And that's one of the main arguments against some of these plans. Is like, well, what's your plan to replace the workforce? And I could go back and highlight DACA teachers and hospital workers when we're already at a shortage of those workers. So great question though.
Wow, thank you so much. And I think that's it for the time that we have today, but I just want to thank you so much for this presentation. And it's been really, really wonderful and comprehensive. And I think a lot of our folks on here can agree, because they've been very, very engaged. So thank you so much, Joe, for joining us. We will be sharing the slideshow and resources in a follow-up email along with the recording of this webinar. And please, for those of you who are on now, join us next week. Stay tuned for our weekly newsletter. You'll see who our presenter will be and the next topic. So thank you all for joining and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.